A man nobody expected walked onto a live stage in front of 3,000 people. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he owned every inch of the room. The crowd went quiet, not the good kind of quiet. The kind that happens when something goes very wrong and nobody has a script for it. The host froze mid-sentence. A camera operator looked at his producer. The producer shrugged. Nobody had a name on the run sheet. Nobody had a seat assigned. Nobody in that building had a clue who authorized this. And yet here he was, center stage, reaching for a microphone with absolute confidence. That confidence was the most unsettling thing about him, because it had no basis in reality. None at all. His name was Steven Seagal. What exactly did he do on that stage to make an entire audience look the other way? Stay with me on this one. Here's what you need to know about Steven Seagal in the year this happened. He was not quite famous anymore. Not completely. He still had fans. Deeply devoted ones, mostly in Eastern Europe, where his direct-to-video movies still moved units. But in Hollywood, the place that had made him, he was something else entirely. He was a story people told at dinner parties. Cautionary tale. A man who had once packed theaters and now couldn't get a return call from a mid-level agent. This is not cruelty. This is just what happened. It happens to a lot of people in that town. The difference with Seagal was that nobody had told him. Or if they had, he hadn't believed them. He arrived at the ceremony in a black SUV. He was wearing a black silk shirt. He was wearing sunglasses inside. He moved through the lobby with the deliberate pace of a man who expected to be recognized at every step. Some people did recognize him. A few even reached for their phones. But not to take a photo. To text someone, "You are not going to believe who just walked in." He had heard about the show 3 weeks earlier. A ceremony honoring American action cinema. A category called Defining Roles of the Genre. His publicist, one of 3 people still returning his calls on a professional basis, had flagged it. Seagal had taken that as an invitation. More than an invitation. A summons. In his mind, the timeline was perfectly clear. He had defined action cinema. Nobody had made more sequels. Nobody had done their own stunts longer. Nobody had trained in Aikido at the level he had. The fact that the invitation hadn't arrived in writing was simply an oversight. Clerical error. These things happened all the time in this industry. He walked into the venue with a +1 he had met at a charity event in Monaco 6 months earlier. She didn't fully understand where they were going. She had thought it was a restaurant. A publicist at the door checked the list twice. The name wasn't there. She checked it a 3rd time. She looked at Seagal. She looked at the list. She asked him to wait. He didn't wait. He stepped around her the way you step around a door that's only halfway closed, and he walked into the main hall. That's when it started. The show had already begun. A comedian was hosting. Young. Sharp. The kind of host who could land a joke about institutional collapse and make it sound like a comment about traffic. He was in the middle of a bit about the golden age of action films when the back door of the hall swung open and Seagal walked in. A few heads turned. Then a few more. A seat filler near the aisle stood up when she saw him, assuming he must belong somewhere. He sat in her seat. She stood against the wall and stayed there. The host finished his bit. The audience applauded. A presenter walked out to announce the first award. Seagal straightened in his chair. He was reading the program. It listed the nominees for defining roles of the genre. His name was not on it. He read it again. Still not there. He turned it over. Nothing on the back either. He sat with that information for about 45 seconds. Then he stood up. He walked toward the stage stairs with a measured, controlled pace. A security guard stepped in his direction. Seagal looked at him with the specific expression of a man who has never, in his life, believed that any security guard was positioned there for him. The guard hesitated. That was all Seagal needed. He climbed the stairs. He crossed the stage. The presenter was mid-sentence. Seagal reached out, gently, and took the microphone from her hand. She let go, partly from shock, partly because the alternative was a visible tug-of-war on live television. The audience went completely silent. Seagal looked out at the crowd. 3,000 faces, cameras, lights, a live broadcast going to 42 countries. He smiled. He had no idea what was about to happen. Here's the thing about silence in a room that big. It has weight. You can feel it pressing on you from all sides. 3,000 people breathing, and none of them making a sound, because none of them know what they're watching. Seagal held the microphone and looked at the crowd. He nodded slowly, like he was taking attendance. "Thank you," he said. Nobody had thanked him. Nobody had introduced him. There was no context for that thank you. It landed like a stone dropped into a swimming pool. The host backstage was watching on a monitor. His stage manager was already on the headset, talking to security. But security had a problem. The problem was that Seagal had the microphone and was standing at center stage, and removing him was going to look on live television significantly worse than letting him speak. So the calculation became, how long does this run? Give him 2 minutes and then pull the plug. The presenter whose microphone Seagal had taken was still standing 3 feet to his left. She didn't leave the stage. She didn't know if she should. She just stood there with the professional smile that performers learn for situations where everything is going wrong and the cameras are still rolling. Seagal began. "I've been part of this industry," he said, "for a very long time." That was true. Nobody in the room could argue with that. And when I look out at this room, I see the future of a tradition that I helped to build. There was a murmur in the crowd. Not agreement, not laughter, something in between. The kind of murmur that comes from 2,000 simultaneous private conversations conducted entirely through eye contact. "You know," Seagal continued, "a lot of people ask me, and they ask me this constantly. They say, 'Steve, what was the moment? What was the moment you knew this was your life?'" He paused. He was clearly expecting a response. He got nothing. And I always say the same thing. I always say, the first day on set for Above the Law. Because that was the day I understood what American action cinema could actually be. A few people in the audience were nodding. Not because they agreed. Because nodding is what humans do when they are trying to survive an uncomfortable situation without direct engagement. A man in the 4th row leaned to his wife. "What movie?" She shrugged. A woman near the back had her phone out. She was filming, but she was also texting. She was texting 16 people simultaneously. The messages were variations on, "You need to turn on the award show right now." On social media, the first clip was already uploading. Seagal moved to his right. He was pacing now. This was something he did in his films when he was about to deliver a moral verdict. He paced. He let the silence work for him. The problem was that the silence in this room was working entirely against him. "I've had conversations with some of the greatest filmmakers in the world," he said. "People you would recognize immediately. People who told me privately, and I don't want to embarrass them by naming names, but privately, they've told me, 'Steve, what you did for action cinema changed everything.'" He stopped pacing. He looked directly into one of the cameras. "I believe that." The presenter beside him made a movement that might have been the beginning of reaching for the microphone, then stopped. She looked off stage. The stage manager shook his head. "Not yet." Backstage, the host was writing something on the back of his notepad. He had handled difficult situations before. He'd had technical failures, drunk presenters. Once, a guest had proposed to an audience member during a segment about tax law. He had managed all of those. This felt different. The audience was restless. People were coughing, shifting in their seats. A child, someone had brought a child to this event, had fallen asleep on her father's shoulder. The father looked at his daughter with what could only be described as intense envy. Seagal was still talking. He had moved on from Above the Law to Hard to Kill to Marked for Death, laying out his filmography the way a man reads from a menu he has memorized. He described each film with the specificity of someone who had clearly thought about very little else for a very long time. The applause cue light began flashing on the side of the stage. Nobody had triggered it. It was either a malfunction or the most accurate commentary of the evening. And then, just as the energy in the room reached its most uncomfortable pitch, something happened. Seagal made a joke. It wasn't a planned joke. It emerged almost accidentally, as he was describing a stunt sequence from a film nobody in the room had seen. He said, "The director told me, we can't insure this." I told him, "I am the insurance." There was a beat, and then, from somewhere near the back, someone laughed. A single genuine laugh. Surprised out of them, the way you sometimes laugh at a funeral when something is just too absurd. It was enough. 3 or 4 people near that person laughed in response. Then a few more. It rippled, cautiously, across the room. Seagal looked up. He absorbed the laughter with quiet dignity. He believed he had won the room. He handed the microphone, gently, ceremonially, back to the presenter. He gave the audience a single, slow nod. He stepped back from the podium. His expression said, "That's how it's done." A thin wave of relieved applause followed him. The kind you give when a plane lands in rough weather. Not celebration. Gratitude for the ending. He turned toward the stairs. Everybody in that room thought it was over. He was 3 steps from the stairs when a voice cut through the polite clapping. "Who is this guy?" It came from the middle of the audience. A man's voice. Not shouting. Just asking. The same tone you'd use to ask who brought the unfamiliar dish to a potluck. Genuinely curious. Genuinely unaware. Seagal stopped. He turned around. Here is where everything changed. Because that question, "Who is this guy?" is not an attack. An attack acknowledges your existence. A question like that suggests your existence is unclear. It is, in some ways, worse than an attack. Seagal took 1 step back toward center stage. "I'm Steven Seagal," he said. A beat. "Steven Seagal," he repeated. A little slower, as if the problem was pronunciation. From the same section of the audience. "Oh yeah." Then, quieter, to the person beside him. Which one was he? The host, who had been preparing to walk out and reclaim the stage gracefully, stopped in the wings. He looked at his producer. His producer had the expression of a man watching a building collapse in slow motion who has just remembered he left something valuable inside. The host walked out. He crossed to center stage with that particular loose confidence that good television hosts carry around like a tool. He put his hand on Seagal's shoulder, that warm, authoritative gesture, and he said, into his own microphone, "Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for a man who needs absolutely no introduction." The joke was that he had just received one, and the introduction had raised more questions than it answered. The audience laughed. A real laugh. The release of something that had been building for 4 minutes. Seagal looked at the host. He was processing what had just happened. He understood he'd been laughed at. And he made the decision, you could see it cross his face in real time. He made the decision not to accept it. "No," he said into his microphone. "No. I want to say something." The host tried to take his arm. Gently, professionally. Seagal stepped aside. "With respect," he said, "I'm not done." Now here's the thing. There are moments in television history that turn on what someone says. And then there are moments that turn on what someone refuses to stop saying. This was the second kind. Seagal reached back for the presenter's microphone. She had been holding it loosely again. She let go again. She was going to have to stop doing that. But in the moment, she let go. And now Steven Seagal had a microphone and was standing at center stage at a major Hollywood awards ceremony, broadcast live to 42 countries, and the host was standing next to him without one. The calculation had changed completely. It was no longer, how long do we let this run? It was, how do we stop this without making it worse? Security moved to the stage stairs. 2 men in dark suits. They stopped at the bottom. Going up those stairs now meant a confrontation visible to every camera in the building. Which was worse. Which was always worse. The producer in the truck made a decision. They would cut to commercial. 30 seconds to break. The director started the countdown. Seagal, who had no idea this was happening, continued. I want to be very clear about something, he said, because I think there's a misunderstanding in this industry about what I actually contributed. And I've been patient. Very patient. 15 seconds. My films didn't just entertain people. They changed how people understood what the human body is capable of. 10 seconds. I trained with the greatest masters of Aikido in Japan. In Japan. That is not something you put in a press release. That is something you put in your soul. 5 seconds. And I would ask, with complete sincerity, that this institution, cut to commercial. The screen went black. In the hall, the lights shifted and the studio logo appeared on the screens. There was a moment of stunned collective silence. Then conversation erupted everywhere simultaneously. Every person in that building was on their phone. Every person was saying some version of the same thing. Are you watching this? The clip had 900,000 views. It had been uploaded for 14 minutes. And backstage, in the corridor near the stage stairs, Seagal was being spoken to by 3 people at once. The head of security, the show's executive producer, and his own publicist who had just arrived, who had not known he was coming tonight, and who looked like someone who had just received the phone call they had been dreading for years. Seagal was listening to all 3 of them with the patient, slightly elevated expression of a man hearing objections he has already decided to overrule. If you're still with me at this point, hit that subscribe button. Because what happened when the cameras came back on is the part people are still talking about. The commercial break lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. During those 4 minutes, 3 things happened. The executive producer made a decision. They would not remove Seagal by force. It would dominate the coverage for a week. The story would become about the show's handling of the situation, not about Seagal himself. Better to let it play out and control the framing afterward. The host made a different decision. He had been handed a gift and he knew it. He had a list of material now written on the back of his notepad. He was going to use it. And Seagal's publicist made the mistake of saying, in the corridor quietly, just to him, "Steven, you need to let this go." Seagal looked at her for a long moment. "Let what go?" he said. She had no answer for that. The cameras came back on. The host walked out first, to a wave of knowing applause. "We're back," he said. "And so is our friend." He gestured toward the wings with the warmth of a man presenting the main event at a heavyweight bout. Seagal walked out. He walked out to applause. Real applause this time. Not because the audience liked him. Because the audience had made a collective decision during the break. This was the best thing that was going to happen tonight. Every person in that room had leaned in. Seagal accepted the applause as entirely natural. He nodded. He looked around the room. "I appreciate that," he said. "I've always appreciated the warmth." The host stood to his right. "We are very glad to have you here," he said, in a tone that walked the exact line between sincerity and something else. Half the audience read it one way, half the other. Seagal heard sincerity. "I want to address," Seagal said, "the question that was raised earlier." He paused. "About who I am." From somewhere in the audience, a man called out, "We know who you are, Steven." It was meant to be supportive. "Mostly. The reason I came tonight," Seagal said, "is because I was not going to let this institution celebrate 40 years of action cinema without acknowledging what actually started it." The host, in his most neutral voice. "And what started it? For those of us who might need a small refresher?" Seagal turned to look at him. He did not register the joke. "Above the Law," he said. 1988. That film introduced a way of moving, a way of fighting that every film since has borrowed from. You can look at any action film from the last 30 years and you will find its DNA in that film. Across the audience, people were writing this down. Not because they believed it, because they wanted to remember it accurately. "I have trained with grandmasters," Seagal continued. "I have worked alongside the FBI. I have served as a reserve deputy sheriff in Louisiana." He listed these items with perfect equanimity, like reading from a resume he had memorized long ago. "I have sold over 250 million records." In the back of the room, a music journalist looked up from his phone for the first time in 20 minutes. The host kept his face entirely neutral. Staggering numbers. And yet, Seagal said, his voice dropping just slightly, I was not listed in the program tonight. He let that sit. I was not listed. The room was completely still. I didn't come here for an award. I want to be clear about that. I didn't come here for recognition. I came here because someone needs to stand in this room and say, the tradition you're celebrating tonight, it didn't begin with the names on your program. It began earlier. It began with men who were willing to do it for real. A woman in the front row had her face in her hands. Not from distress. She was trying not to laugh. Trying very hard. I want to thank the Academy, Seagal said. This was not the Academy. This was a completely separate organization with no connection to any academy. Nobody corrected him. I want to thank my fans. In Russia, in Kazakhstan, in Eastern Europe, the people who have always understood what American cinema is really about. The host, who had been holding himself together with remarkable professional discipline, allowed himself one brief smile. He turned it into a cough. I want to say to this industry, Seagal said, that I forgive you. The room went completely still. I forgive you for the years of overlooking what I built. I understand it. I don't hold it. Because what I've built doesn't require your acknowledgement to be real. He nodded once, slowly, like a man who has just solved something that has needed solving for a long time. It is what it is. Then he set the microphone on the podium. He straightened his jacket. He looked out at 3,000 faces. Some of them had tears running down their cheeks. Not from being moved. From the sustained effort of not making a sound. He turned. He walked, slowly, with complete dignity, toward the stairs. He descended them. He crossed the main floor. He walked through the doors. In the hall, for a long moment, nobody said anything. Then the host stepped forward. He picked up the microphone from the podium. He looked at the audience. He said, the insurance. The entire room came apart. The SUV was waiting where he had left it. He climbed in. He adjusted his sunglasses. He asked the driver to find somewhere for dinner. He was thinking Japanese. There was a place in West Hollywood he liked. His phone was ringing. His publicist. His manager. 2 unknown numbers. A journalist from a publication that had interviewed him in 2019. He silenced them all. He looked out the window as the car pulled into evening traffic. The streets looked the same as they always did. The city was just the city. In his mind, he was reviewing what had happened, reconstructing it the way a coach reviews a game, looking for the key moments, identifying what had worked. He had come in. He had spoken honestly. He had said the things that needed to be said. He had reminded an industry of something it was in danger of forgetting. He had walked out with his dignity intact. That was, to his satisfaction, essentially what had happened. At that moment, the clip was at 2.3 million views. His publicist, still in the hall, was looking at her phone with the expression of someone watching a wildfire from a balcony. She had been handling difficult situations in Hollywood for 22 years. She had learned long ago that there were 2 kinds of bad publicity. Bad publicity you could manage and bad publicity that managed you. This was becoming the second kind at a rate she had never seen before. The clip was everywhere. Every entertainment site had it. 3 major news outlets had picked it up. And something unusual was happening. The coverage was splitting into 2 distinct camps. The first, disbelief. The second, and this one was growing faster by the hour. Something that resembled, almost against the audience's own will, a kind of affection. Not admiration, not respect, but a specific tender, rueful fondness that people sometimes develop for things that are unambiguously, completely and openly themselves. Because here's the thing. Here's what people were saying in comments and group chats and late-night conversations across the world. He meant it. Whatever else you said about Steven Seagal walking onto a stage, he was not invited to and delivering a 6-minute speech to a room full of people who barely remembered his name. He meant every single word. There was no performance in it. No irony. No calculated angle. No publicist-approved messaging. He stood in front of 3,000 people and told them the truest thing he knew about himself. That's rare. It's rare even in people who have the evidence to back it up. In a town built on performance, on the careful construction of image, on the managed distance between what you are and what you project, a man had walked onto a stage and said, "This is it. This is all of it. No filter. No strategy. Just a man and what he believed about his own life." People could not stop watching it. At 3 in the morning, Seagal was at his kitchen table with green tea. He was reading a real book. He had no idea about the view count. He didn't check social media. He had people for that, he felt, though most of those people had quietly moved on. He was reading about Japanese feudal history. He was, at that moment, completely content. 3 time zones away, his daughter was watching the clip for the 5th time. She was in her mid-20s. She had complicated feelings about her father, the way you do when your father is a specific kind of man. But watching the clip, watching him stand there, completely committed, completely certain of himself, in a room full of people quietly losing their minds, she laughed. A real laugh. The kind that came from somewhere she hadn't expected. She called him. He picked up on the 2nd ring. "Dad," she said. "Hey," he said. "I saw the clip." "What clip?" A pause. "Of tonight." "Oh," he said. "How'd it look?" She thought about that. How did it look? It looked like him. Exactly like him. Which was, depending on how you held it, either the most embarrassing or the most remarkable thing she could imagine. "It looked like you," she said. He made a small sound. Satisfied. "Good." They talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular. She asked if he'd eaten. He told her about the Japanese food. She reminded him about something on the weekend. He said he'd be there. When she hung up, she sat for a moment in the quiet of her apartment. She pulled the clip up one more time. There he was. Center stage. No invitation. No apology. Under the lights, saying the truest thing he knew about himself, to an audience that had absolutely no idea what to do with it. She watched him walk off the stage. Slowly. Like a man who has done exactly what he came to do. Then she closed the app and went to bed. The clip hit 4 million by morning. 16 million by the end of the week. Nobody called to offer him a role. Nobody reached out about a retrospective or a segment or a feature. Nobody asked him to come back. But in comment sections and group chats and conversations in living rooms and bars across the world, people kept coming back to the same man. The man who had walked into a room that didn't want him, said what he needed to say, and walked back out. Completely certain. Completely alone. Completely himself. Some people called it sad. Some people called it something else entirely.